Hello and welcome to Night Clerk Radio. This is episode 123, Exploring Japanese Ambient Music. I'm Ross Payton, and with me, as always, is my good friend and co-host, Burke. How are you doing?
I'm fine, as always. What if I just gave a different answer? I always think about this when you're doing your intro. And what if, like, how you doing? I'm like, well, I'm fucking terrible, man. And just started talking.
Well, hopefully this music will cheer you up.
You have to put on a happy face for the people. I have to say I'm fine when you know you're not doing fine.
Aww.
It's okay.
Getting very philosophical right off the bat.
I was just thinking about it, like just totally bombing an episode out in the first 30 seconds. But I'm living up to the YouTube comment. There's a YouTube comment that's like, oh, that second guy's kind of a big bummer. Like one of our videos. And I think about that a lot. I'm like, yeah, I am. I can be.
Yeah. Yeah, the way people react to podcasts, regular little bits.
It's very funny.
It is. But this is a very special episode because it's ordered by God himself.
It is. It actually is. Yeah. So a little background story is one of our listeners on the Night Clerk Radio Patreon Discord posted an article on Discogs called Exploring Ambient Music Boom of the 80s and 90s. And it got posted at the exact same second that I had just had Kankyo and Gaku came up, which we'll talk about specifically what that is in a second. It's a very famous collection of Japanese ambient from the 80s and 90s. And I just happened to be listening to it when that was posted. And I had been thinking about doing this as a topic because it's a really interesting period of music production. And I was like, well, this is just like a synchronicity that I can't ignore. We have to do this episode now. Mm-hmm. It's divine fate. Something came together and said, do this. And we're doing it.
Yeah. Japanese ambient music. Now, in our show notes, we'll have a lot of articles that Burke found, providing some context to it, and we'll be referencing them in this episode. But, one of my first thoughts was Japanese city pop music was influential and foundational to vaporwave, and it was largely unknown outside of Japan when it was actually being made, but, was discovered later in the West, in the 2010s. And you can say the same thing to a degree about Japanese ambient music because it was largely unknown outside of Japan for the longest time. But in the 2010s, for a variety of reasons, it became popular. And I think it's probably influenced a lot of ambient music that has come since then. And I think one of the ways to distinguish Japanese ambient music versus other ambient music is the fact they didn't even call it ambient music. In the time, they called it environmental music. Yep. Because it was a lot of different environmental or a lot of different influences were coming in at this time. Like the 80s and 90s were Japan's economic heyday, a lot of money, and they also had a rising amount of synth technology was being put on the market cheaper and more powerful than ever. And also this is a couple years after Brian Eno's Music for Airports. And people started listening to it and what if we do my own take on it? And Japanese artists had a lot of interesting ways to what could I do, with this influence and some other influences to make something new and interesting. It's very cool music. I've been listening to it for the last 2 weeks, and it is a very peaceful way to sort of de-stress in an otherwise very stressful world. I'll say that. Sure.
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on. That was a good intro. There's a lot to unpack. So I think how I would want to structure this is why nowadays it's been popular, which is a fairly interesting story in and of itself, because I am one of these algorithm victims of this, basically. So it's hard to pinpoint exact motions, but really in 2019, it started to be a rise in sampling of this music. So one of these articles talks about Vampire Weekend, Mac DeMarco, Jay Dilla, et cetera, all started sampling this music from Japan. And then this album came out, the one I mentioned, which is really where it launched off for me, and I think probably for a lot of people in this era, if they weren't already familiar with it, is this Kankyo and Gaku, which is Japanese for environmental music. It's, it's literally the name of the genre. And it was a big, very popular compilation put out by a Seattle label, Light in the Attic. I think it really captured a lot of people's interest. It's one of these things where I don't know what it is about these sort of Japanese artists, but if you get them into your recommends on YouTube, they just blow up and take over. And I don't know if what drives that. We've joked about somebody turning the knobs behind the scenes and kind of pushing things a little bit here and there. So maybe there's a huge like Japan music head running the parts of the YouTube algorithm. But it's not just for this. It is true that once you listen to any of this music, like any of these things on this Discogs list we'll post, I immediately started seeing a bunch of others show up. So there's probably like something where people are more likely to listen to lots of it. Like you're more likely to get repeat clicks. Same with like when I listen to Konkyo Ongaku, we would get a lot of recommends over and over again. Unrelated, but like Japanese jazz is the same way.
Oh yeah.
Every so often certain artists just like blow up on the algorithm and then you get tons of them.
Who's that artist with the beagle on their album cover?
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. Flying Beagle by
Himiko Kikuchi.
Yeah, I've listened to that album a couple times.
And it has so many views. That's from the 80s. Again, more like jazz fusion-y.
I mean, yesterday I was listening to a Japanese jazz tronica mix that I downloaded from YouTube while I was driving around. It's really good driving music.
Oh, yeah. Another big viral one, again, in the jazz space is Matsuyoshi Takanaka, who we've definitely watched in tub. He has a giant surfboard guitar. We've done, that's like a pretty common viral video where he plays it's a gigantic surfboard, but like the middle is cut out to have a fretboard.
Nice.
It's very silly, but yeah, he has a ton of these albums that kind of go viral. And it's the same thing. Cassiopeia is another one that's really popular. There's like a 70s, 80s jazz group. I'm getting jazz sidelined because that's probably what I listen to a little bit more of. But you also see this in these ambient artists. And I always wondered like where that algorithmic reinforcement comes from. A little bit of it, I was worried a little bit of like Orientalism or something, like obsession with Japan as like a culture. Like this mysterious other. Look at they do the music that we do. You know, I don't know. There's some of that weirdness, but it is its own thing.
Well, I think one of the things that could explain why it's so popular on the algorithm is because a lot of this music was really music ahead of its time.
Yeah.
In that, you know, one of the first things I thought of when thinking about this is like back in the 80s and 90s, you had to deliberately choose to put on music. You had to go out and buy it. Unless it was on the radio, that was the only sort of passive listening available, right? Like everything else, you had to buy a thing and put it in another thing and push a button and then listen to it. And then you'd have to pop it out, whether it was a vinyl record, a tape, or a CD later on. And like, that's not what ambient really thrives on, right? Ambient really takes off in an era where you can just set up a playlist or a streaming thing and just have it go. And I think this kind of music is optimized for streaming formats where you can just put it on and forget about it. And that's the day, you know, like you could just have this on in a coffee shop or at home and just listen to it all day long and be quite happy. So I think that has something to do with it as well. It's just optimized for this kind of platform.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely like a technological component. So sort of transitioning into talking about music of the era and dovetailing off that technology point is, I do think there's also like a rise of longer home formats, like the cassette and the CD, even just for people listening at the time. And some of this may be cultural or like expectations or habit. But I have a bunch of ambient on vinyl, like Random Brian Eno and stuff. And it does get you out of it flipping the side of the record every 18 minutes or something, compared to like, oh, I can just put on this whole playlist of all 4 music for airports.
Yeah.
And just listen to all of them. Yeah. And I don't have to move. I can just focus on the music and there's no other concerns. And even getting out to like, if you have a cassette player where you maybe don't have to flip it, but especially like a CD where you have like an hour plus of music. Yeah. There's that rise of technology. So yeah, it's interesting talking about the influences of the time other than the technology, like playing with synths, new recording formats, a move from analog to digital is a thing we can talk about. There's interesting influences. Like I said, there's Brian Eno, which you've pointed to. I mean, he literally coined the term, right? Like I think ambient, the term ambient's attributed to him. But there's also like a rising obsession with Eric Satie in this era in Japan. Yeah, like he did this whole, furniture music. It was like ambient of the late 1800s, early 1900s. Like just very calm, kind of meandering piano music.
Yeah, I did see that in one of the articles. He was talking about that and linked some of his music. There's a whole lot of influences coming into this. It's not just like Brian Eno showed up in Japan and people are like, aha, Yeah,
there's like a rise of interest in like surrealism and Dadaism. Was like another part, which is, a little more visual, but to kind of bring some of those philosophies over to music. Because, the ambient itself, just spoilers. We're probably not going to talk too much about specific albums because there's a ton of them. They cover a lot of ground, and I think I'm more interested in like the cultural aspects of the rise of this. So if this is something where you have some like insight into it, definitely appreciate like some feedback or like additional points, which is always super useful. But I think the rise of all these competing genres is fascinating because even across like a compilation album like Kankyo, you hear a lot of different influences, but there's also, if you dig into things, there's like traditional, what you think of as like droney, sort of sparkly field recording type ambient, all the way to like stuff where it's a little more tongue in cheek. Like one I really liked, I guess I'll shout out one album, was like Yasaki Shimizu's Music for Commercials from 1987.
Oh, I love that album. That was actually, yeah.
I really, really like, but it is like a little more focused in like a concept than being like kind of drifty ambient. But then there's another one that I listened to, and I had trouble finding it because like the YouTube link was busted. But Toshiya Tsukugawa's Compositions for Magnetic Tape, which is like an exploration of the move from analog away into like other recording methods.
Like CD.
Yeah, or like cassette and CD and everything. Well, magnetic tape. So they're thinking cassettes in the early 80s. CDs maybe a couple years out from mainstream. But it's...
Oh, I see. From vinyl to magnetic tape, I guess.
Yeah. From vinyl to magnetic tape. Sorry, it's 83.
Yeah.
But it is not like this calming nature sounds or like commercial music. It is just glitch. It's like early glitch. It's all about like static and feedback. Very creative, but very much more difficult if you're looking for like the ambient listening experience. It is really an outlier in that regard.
Yeah, that's one I did not get a chance to listen to.
It's hard to dig up.
Well, you have to send me a
It's
link
not
after
just
that.
like sitting on YouTube like all the others. Some of his albums are, but it's like in little B-sides and stuff.
You know, one of the things I found interesting is a lot of this ambient is, you know, obviously synth technology used in there, but they use a lot of real instruments and nature field recordings as well. And many of them feature the sound of waves and like water dripping, like those little bamboo devices they have in Zen gardens that fill up with water and go clunk. It kind of, I could look up the name, but why would I do that?
I just thought of like, is there a machine that goes clunk?
Yeah. The thing about Japanese ambient music that I found really interesting is that, you know, there is this integration of synth and real and music and field recordings in a very, like, it all made sense to the composers to integrate all these things. And this was sort of like a new field, right? Like there wasn't decades already of existing music to like, oh yes, well, everyone else is doing. These were the like pioneers in sort of this field in a way. And, you know, having recently visited Japan, you kind of look around and see how integrated shrines and temples are and the appreciation of nature in sort of a deep cultural level that we don't really have in like, say, America or Europe. And I think that led to it where, especially in the 80s and 90s, they, you know, were having this economic boom and the frenetic, high-paced energy of society that would lead a lot of people wanting, you know, more relaxation and more tranquility, you know, more something peaceful to contrast with the hectic day. I mean, this is also like a society where like talking on the subway or train is kind of like a little bit of a faux pas, right? Like the appreciation for silence or natural sounds is on a, you know, it's more visible in the culture than like, say, in America, where if you can't blare it out with loud music, you blare it out with a loud, you know, car engine or something.
Yeah. Yeah. The economics of the time are interesting was another thing I was thinking about. The economics of the time, like you're talking about this boom was another thing that was kind of interesting me to talk about because it goes back to like the material conditions of art and art being political, like even this ambient art, because a lot of these artists actually were supported by like old school patronage. It wasn't just that they had new technology and that they had, you know, a new revived interest in certain art movements or musical movements or other genres. All those contribute. But one of the most important things is that there is corporate money behind it at the time too. Like the Music for Commercials album I recommended, that is actually music from commercials. That's all music that he was commissioned to make for commercials. It's not just like a tongue-in-cheek making fun of like, oh, this is what I would put in a commercial.
Yeah.
It's actually a compilation of works composed for advertisements.
Yeah.
So, you can't deny just like the importance of just dumping money into artists to do what they want, instead of generic, I don't know, what do we have over here? I don't want to idolize one over the other, but like, I don't know, are we dumping a lot of corporate money into like shitty ukulele pieces for corporate ads?
Yeah, no,
like you get what you put money into in some sense. Like, there's always, of course, you can have like punk DIY operating outside the system, but it's always best to just fund the good shit, man.
Yeah, no, for real. I mean, also at the time it was a way for to build, corporate prestige and like it was a, PR move to be like, yes, we're a sophisticated, powerful corporation, so we can have this avant-garde art being created for us. Mm-hmm. I think that's why like you see so many abstract sculptures in especially like corporate environments and buildings, that kind of things. Cause like it shows that you can hire a highly skilled artist to make something. And two, it's abstract. So like no one can complain about it.
Yeah. There is the third thing though, in the US at least, which is like, I'm sorry if this is kind of what you're talking about already, mm-hmm. but there's also like the CIA funding abstract art. So that you can look and say like, look how free we are over here. We can make this nonsense, cause mm-hmm. we're not, under the boot of Stalinism or communism later in the 80s or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have the freedom to make all this wild ass art.
Yeah.
It's just such a funny propaganda tool, but whatever.
You got to defeat that social realism.
That's right.
You can't have those thick-necked workers.
Fuck your pragmatism.
Yeah.
I got soup cans from Warhol.
Like music for commercials really stood out to me too, because it had those manic bursts of energy that like were not present at all in most of the other albums. But like it makes sense in context. Yeah, of course you'd want like some energy, some really high energy pieces to sell whatever product they were for. Yeah, it was great. But I really do like a lot of this. This music is really fascinating too, because it was. They sort of had their own little scene for it. And I can't remember the name, but like there was like a record store that started importing Brian Eno's music. And that sort of became like a locus point in Tokyo for a lot of these artists. And so they all knew each other and they were all working and sort of listening to each other's work and sort of iterating on what you could tell. Like that Discogs article goes in like chronological order, right? Like, from the 80s to the 90s. And you can kind of hear how different ideas are introduced and sort of iterated upon through, like from Stillway 1982 to all the way into the 90s with Oasis of the Wind 2, A Story of Forest and Water, which I quite enjoyed. One of the other articles you mentioned, it's not just limited to the 80s and 90s. It's just a Japanese guide to ambient music. It does mention...
I think we're about to say the same thing because it goes up to 2010.
Yeah.
Merzbow.
Merzbow. Yeah, that's it. I love Merzbow. That was my introduction to noise music.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, maybe Aphex Twin, but like, it was around the same time I was getting into Aphex Twin. I was like, if you like Aphex Twin, check out Merzbow. And I was like, all right. Oh, this is a fun looking album cover. I was like, oh, this is very different. He was, he had that walrus with a bucket as his little mascot for the longest time. Yeah. A lot of these composers, these artists are really not too worried about being too commercial. They're very, for whatever reason, they could stay in a niche and just work a long time over years and years and build up a real interesting body of work over this. So yeah, it's real cool stuff.
Yeah. I think also when we talk about influences, there's a few other names I feel like that show up in liner notes or discussions of albums that are interesting. So other minimalist composers, like there's a 1984 album by Oscillation Circuit that pulls heavily from like Steve Reich and Philip Glass.
Oh, yeah.
Both of who are like minimalist people I like, particularly. I mean, I think you've talked about Koyaanisqatsi plenty of times. And then I think I was playing the Kundun soundtrack with Glass over meme videos the other night, which is a real nightmare.
I think some of these albums I could hear like influences from like Japanese like folk and like theater music, like no theater.
Sure.
Yeah. And so again, drawing from a lot of different elements. But like it seemed to be the point like where they would reference it and then they would riff on it or iterate on it rather than just like, hey, remember this? So there's also a lot of real interesting, instrumentation too. Like, we mentioned they used field recording and like all these new like synthesizers. But today I learned about sanukate, the stones that make a current sound when struck. These are volcanic hardened rocks that you can make into kind of like a xylophone sort of thing. And at least some of these instruments, it is world famous as the world's only music instrument of stone, including a stone xylophone that can play 2 octaves. Some of these albums would use this. And I was just, that's neat. They just found stones that would make an interesting sound when struck.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that stuff is definitely interesting. That sort of instrumentation, just in general, we've talked about it, but I love like a lot of the synth and production play of this era, both in like somebody like but also you see across most of these, because that was another way that they had to do it. Not everybody had big whole string quartets or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I figuring out where I want to go with this, because it's still like, I don't know, 6 years after that big Kankyo Gaku compilation that really blew a lot of this up. It feels like it's still going strong. Everyone gets stuck in their own little algorithm bubble or whatever, but I feel like new stuff still shows up. Partially that's because I follow channels, we've talked about Tardy Biscuits and stuff like that, which I haven't actually seen them post in a while. And there's that Terminal Velocity channel, I think it was called also, that would just post like whole albums pretty much of like really obscure 60s through 90s, really music from all over the world, but definitely some Japanese music. Now that I think about it, I haven't seen them post in a while. And now I'm scared.
Oh, no.
Now I'm worried about that. There's still, if they got copyright obliterated, every so often the Sentinels come by and just decide that you're not allowed to share this 50-year-old album no one's heard of anyway.
Oh, yeah. Content ID is a merciless god.
Yeah, I don't give a shit.
One thing we should mention is also one of the artists was, Harumi Hosono, who worked on Yellow Magic Orchestra, and he's in that compilation you mentioned. Yep. And so, yeah, there's a lot of crossover. Like, artists wouldn't just stay in one genre. So there's a lot of these artists are also, it's kind of like dark ambient artists being like a side project of
Dungeon Synth as a side project.
Yeah. Dungeon Synth. Sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the same kind of thing to some degree, but there's just a huge amount of work that if you really like ambient music, like you should definitely look into this era and check out some of the albums mentioned in these articles, because there's a lot of them. And like once you get, the algorithm sort of like realize, oh, you like this, huh? Well, we could just feed it to you forever.
Yep.
There's worse fates than that. Yeah.
Yeah. The Yellow Magic Orchestra, now that we say it out loud, is an interesting, like you said, Hosono's inspiration into this. But like that also had Ryuichi Sakamoto, who was also like a YouTube algorithm god.
Oh,
like
man.
5 or 6 years ago, and probably still is. But like a lot of his albums were getting shared around. So like they both pretty impactful in terms of spreading, Japanese music outside of the country. It's interesting.
Yeah.
A band that I know in passing, but I probably haven't listened to as much as, I could. I guess I say that about a lot of stuff. You only have so much time to listen to stuff. I don't know why. Worry about what you haven't listened to. But they do have like 3 huge, incredibly influential members. So like, people don't know Takahashi, the drummer, as well, but I do. I think, are they all dead now? They might all be gone now.
Oh.
I know at least Sakamoto and the drummer are. Oh, no. Hosono's still alive. Oh, thank God. He's still around. But the other 2 have unfortunately passed. I mean, it was very, very, very famous when Sakamoto died a couple of years ago. Kind of like a reevaluation of his impact on spreading music. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder, though, since these are all recommendations that are delayed, I'm curious what like the current state of ambient music is from Japanese artists.
Oh, that would be
something worth digging into, because these are really like all of the articles, of course, it goes up to the one has Merce from 2010, of course. But in general, this is like a historic survey of a very specific booming period of the genre's history in the overall.
That was just unknown outside of Japan. And that's why it's, now it's
until
being
a couple
discovered.
years ago,
Yeah.
it's like being rediscovered in the past 5 years or so, maybe a little bit longer. On like a mass level, of course, I'm sure people knew about it beforehand, but like really, like we said, showing up on YouTube all the time. There's tons of like vinyl reissues now of these albums, which they probably never thought would happen.
No joke.
So like as early as 2017, there's like a 2017 repressing of that music for commercials. And some of the Hosono stuff had like repressings, I think, a couple years ago. So, but I'm curious to see how that's influencing like the current state of ambient music. Like outside of, I think the only current like Japanese music we're tied into in this electronic space is like the Nagoya vaporwave scene from the Signal Wave crew.
Oh yeah.
But I'd be curious about some of these more.
That could be a future episode. Yeah, we should current server. Yeah.
And it may be one of these things where like you really realize the impact of like just having all of that material support from companies at the time. You know, it may have unfortunately died back down, but then at the same time, like production and dissemination of your music has gotten cheaper and easier. So that's I think that's an interesting possible future episode topic is like, what does this boom like look like today? Not just in reissuing, repressing, re-listening to stuff from the 80s, which is fun. I'm glad that all the stuff is just there, sitting there on YouTube or Bandcamp or whatever. It's great to just be able to listen to it. But like, what new stuff are we making?
Sure. Well, it's also, one thing I think that is different in Japan, at least, is that it's much more possible to focus on an artistic niche and still be able to make a living at it, with like lower cost of living and like lower rent and cheaper food and that kind of thing. Like there's a way for an artist to do something that's, something that doesn't have widespread appeal, but still has an audience. And so I think there's more room for people to have long careers doing weirdly specific things that are, very interesting to a certain subset of people, as opposed to like, America, where, boy, good luck if you want to do something weird and artistic and still make a living from it. So,
yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to see if that's true. I'm curious to see if our Japanese listeners have some feedback on that. Our Japanese musicians who listen to this.
Yeah, exactly.
What is that like? Because I think it's easy to like idealize certain aspects of other cultures. Like, oh, I don't have to worry about health insurance.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like you do over here. But I mean, other stuff is expensive and there could be other like cultural pressures or whatever you may not be aware of.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I'd
be curious.
Yeah. I did remember reading some blog article talking about like how certain niche fashion trends were possible in Japan and not in America because you could just like make handmade shoes or pants or whatever and still make a living because like you could afford a hole in the wall in Tokyo and there would be enough people in Tokyo to support you because there would be a little scene in magazines explaining like different, types of shoes and pants that would be like, yeah.
So I can give a not an artistic example, but a funny, similar example of like a cultural difference that makes something easier is a lot of times, I don't know if this is still true, but this was maybe true like 10 years ago, is a lot of the best rating guilds in WoW were based in Europe, like in terms of doing world firsts, because they had such good worker protections. It was easy for them to all together take like 3 weeks off at a time when a new raid came out.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And just grind.
Yeah.
Whereas you can do that in the US if you're a professional if you're a professional streamer. But yeah, that doesn't give you 20 or 20
you need 20 people to do that. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So that was a pretty funny, that may not still be true, but it was just, all these European guilds are banging out these world firsts in like new mythic content in region because they could all just take off work.
Yeah. They could just put in the hours.
They had worker protections.
Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, material conditions change how art is made. Weird. News at 11.
But that's what you say when you say like stuff's political, because people are like, it's not political. I don't mention Democrats at all. It's like, yeah, but you live in a world where it was made, Like,
how was it made and who made it and under
and why?
Yeah. Weird.
And what, what can they support themselves off doing that and shit?
Exactly. Yeah. Anything takeaway, just check out these articles and take a listen to some of this music.
Yep.
It's great. It's very good ambient and it is an insight into, a different time and place. It'll be interesting to see what we can detect of its influence in current Japanese ambient music. So perhaps in the future we'll investigate.
Yeah. Yeah. And specifically ambient music, not just like ambient being interesting in like vaporwave or whatever, because one of the articles has mentioned like OPN and stuff, but that's not really quite what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
I'm looking for like people who specifically want to do ambient.
thank you all so much for listening to this episode. It was a lot of fun to listen to nice, peaceful Japanese ambient music, environmental music, for a couple weeks. And next episode, we're going to be learning about ListenCore, another vaporwave focused magazine / publication. And that should be a lot of fun. And if you want to support artists making art or podcasts, please check out our Patreon, patreon.com/nightclerkradio. We have a lot of bonus episodes on our Patreon. We are working on some new rewards, and we have some wallpaper art. And of course, we have the Discord, which is a lovely community where there is a lot of cool music and stuff being linked to every day.
Yeah, I feel bad. There's a lot of activity on there that I'm like, oh, thank you for linking that. But then I'm like in the middle of working, so I don't say anything. And then that's just sketched out my brain. Yeah,
I've been trying to be better about, like, if I post a link to a little video, I try and explain what the video is and why I thought it was interesting, So, and we're on Blue Sky. We have a website, nightclerkradio.com. And we're on social medias. There's a Facebook page. I forget to update it.
Boo.
But we're definitely on Blue Sky. And please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever and whichever. And thank you again so much. And we'll talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.